The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of the Military Medical Center in San Diego. Sarah Chen pulled her worn Honda into a spot near the main entrance, careful to avoid the puddles from last night's rain. She checked her reflection in the rearview mirror one last time, tucking a stray piece of dark hair behind her ear. The casual clothes she wore, jeans and a simple navy blue sweater, felt comfortable for what she thought would be a quick consultation meeting. At 32 years old, Sarah had spent the last decade of her life dedicated to emergency medicine. Her hands, steady and sure, had sutured countless wounds, stabilized trauma patients, and quite literally held beating hearts during critical surgeries. She had completed her residency at one of the busiest trauma centers in Los Angeles, where gunshot wounds and car accidents were as common as coffee breaks. But none of that showed on her small frame as she walked toward the entrance of the building. The Military Medical Center stood like a fortress of concrete and glass, its walls holding stories of healing and loss that stretched back decades. Sarah had been invited here by Dr. Patricia Morrison, the head of emergency services, to discuss a potential collaboration between civilian trauma centers and military medical units. It was supposed to be an informal meeting, a conversation over coffee about shared protocols and training methods. Patricia had specifically told her to dress casually, that it was just going to be a handful of doctors talking shop. Sarah pushed through the heavy glass doors and approached the reception desk. A young corpsman with neat hair and pressed uniforms looked up from his computer screen. His name tag read, Martinez. "Good morning," Sarah said with a warm smile. "I'm Dr. Sarah Chen. I have a meeting with Dr. Morrison at 9. Martinez typed something into his computer, then frowned slightly. "Dr. Morrison, let me check on that for you." He picked up a phone and spoke quietly into it. After a moment, he hung up and gave Sarah an apologetic look. Dr. Morrison got called into an emergency surgery about an hour ago. She left a message saying the meeting has been moved to conference room B on the 3rd floor. Someone will meet you there. Sarah felt a small flutter of uncertainty. She had assumed this would be a small, casual gathering, but conference room B sounded more formal than she had expected. Still, she thanked Martinez and made her way to the elevator. The 3rd floor was quieter than the lobby. The hallway stretched out before her, lined with doors bearing official-looking plaques and military insignias. Her sneakers made soft, squeaking sounds on the polished linoleum floor. She found conference room B at the end of the hall and paused outside the door, taking a breath before entering. The room was larger than she expected, with a long oak table that could easily seat 20 people. Large windows overlooked the base, giving a view of the neat rows of buildings and the perfectly maintained grounds. But what caught Sarah's attention immediately was the number of people already seated around the table. There were at least 15 officers in the room, all in various military uniforms. The air felt heavy with formality and rank. Sarah's casual clothes suddenly felt very out of place. She hesitated in the doorway, wondering if she had walked into the wrong meeting entirely. "Dr. Chen?" a kind voice called out from the far end of the table. A woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and warm brown eyes stood up. She wore a white coat over her uniform. "Please, come in. I'm Dr. Lisa Hernandez." Patricia sends her apologies. "We had a multi-vehicle accident come in early this morning, and she's still in surgery." Sarah entered the room, acutely aware of the eyes that turned toward her. She could feel judgment in some of those gazes, particularly from a stern-looking officer seated near the head of the table. He had silver eagles on his shoulders, marking him as a colonel. His face was weathered and hard, with deep lines around his mouth that suggested he frowned more often than he smiled. His eyes swept over Sarah's casual attire with obvious disapproval. "This is Dr. Sarah Chen from Los Angeles Memorial Trauma Center," Dr. Hernandez continued, gesturing for Sarah to take a seat. "She's here to discuss potential collaboration between civilian emergency medicine programs and our combat medical training." Sarah moved toward an empty chair, trying to project confidence despite feeling underdressed and unprepared. As she set her bag down and pulled out her notebook, she caught the colonel muttering something to the major seated beside him. The words were quiet, but in the silence of the room, they carried. "Is this what passes for professional these days? Looks like she just rolled out of bed." Sarah's cheeks burned. but she kept her face neutral. She had dealt with dismissive comments before. The medical field, despite its progress, still had its share of people who judged books by their covers. She had learned long ago that the best response was to let her work speak for itself. Dr. Hernandez, apparently having heard the comment as well, shot the colonel a sharp look before turning back to Sarah. As I was saying, we're very interested in your experience with mass casualty incidents and your triage protocols. We've read your published papers on emergency field medicine, and we believe there's much we can learn from civilian trauma centers. The meeting began in earnest, with Dr. Hernandez leading a discussion about medical response times, resource allocation during emergencies, and the challenges of treating multiple critical patients simultaneously. Sarah found her footing as the conversation progressed. This was her territory, the world where she excelled. She spoke about a night 6 months ago when a nightclub fire had sent 43 patients to her emergency room within 20 minutes. She described how her team had set up triage stations in the parking lot, how they had prioritized patients based on the severity of injuries, and how they had managed to save all but 2 of the victims. Some of the officers around the table leaned forward, genuinely interested. They asked questions about supply management, communication protocols, and how civilian hospitals handled the psychological toll on medical staff. Sarah answered each question with specific examples and practical insights gained from years in the trenches of emergency medicine. But the colonel, whose nameplate identified him as Colonel Richard Brennan, seemed determined to find fault. He interrupted Sarah multiple times, questioning her statistics, challenging her methods, and generally treating her like an inexperienced intern rather than a respected trauma surgeon. That approach might work in a controlled hospital environment, he said during one of Sarah's explanations, his tone dripping with condescension. But in real combat situations, with bullets flying and bombs going off, I doubt your pretty little protocols would hold up very well. Sarah took a slow breath before responding. With respect, Colonel, a trauma bay at 3 in the morning with gang shooting victims, car crash patients, and overdose cases all coming in at once isn't exactly a controlled environment. The chaos might be different, but the pressure and the stakes are just as high, Colonel Brennan scoffed. It's hardly the same thing as battlefield medicine. You work in clean rooms with unlimited supplies and backup just a phone call away. Actually, Sarah said calmly, we often run low on blood supplies, our equipment breaks down, and we frequently have to improvise. Last month, I performed an emergency thoracotomy in our ambulance bay because the patient was crashing and we couldn't wait to get him inside. I used a penknife sterilized with alcohol wipes because it was faster than getting a surgical kit. A few of the officers exchanged glances, impressed despite themselves, but Colonel Brennan simply shook his head. A penknife surgery? That sounds reckless and dangerous. That kind of cowboy medicine might make for a good story, but it's not proper medical practice. Before Sarah could respond, Dr. Hernandez intervened. Colonel, Dr. Chen's decision-making in that case saved a 19-year-old's life. The boy had a penetrating chest wound and was in cardiac arrest. Her quick thinking and willingness to adapt to the situation demonstrated exactly the kind of field medicine mindset we're trying to foster. The colonel leaned back in his chair, clearly unconvinced. His arms crossed over his chest and his expression remained skeptical. Throughout the rest of the meeting, he continued to make small comments under his breath, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. Comments about civilian doctors playing at being tough, about the softness of people who had never served, about respect for military tradition and protocol. Sarah did her best to ignore him and focus on the other officers who were genuinely engaged with her presentation. She shared case studies, showed photographs of their triage systems, and discussed the psychological support programs her hospital had implemented for staff dealing with the trauma of their work. As the meeting stretched toward its second hour, Dr. Hernandez suggested a short break. People stood, stretched, and broke into smaller conversation groups. Sarah remained seated, reviewing her notes and trying to shake off the frustration she felt from Colonel Brennan's continued dismissiveness. She was so focused on her papers that she didn't notice someone approaching until a shadow fell across her notebook. She looked up to find a young lieutenant standing beside her chair. He was tall and lean, with short blonde hair and striking blue eyes. Despite his youth, probably not much older than 28 or 29, He carried himself with a quiet confidence that suggested experience beyond his years. "Dr. Chen," he said, his voice soft and respectful. "I'm Lieutenant James Parker. I just wanted to say that I found your presentation fascinating. That case study about the multi-vehicle pileup on the interstate was particularly interesting." Sarah smiled, grateful for the kind words. "Thank you, Lieutenant. Are you with the medical corps?" "No, ma'am," he said. "I'm a SEAL team medic, but I've been pushing for more cross-training between military combat medics and civilian emergency medicine. I think we have a lot to learn from each other." They talked for a few minutes about the overlap between combat medicine and civilian trauma care. Lieutenant Parker shared stories from his deployments, describing situations where he had to treat wounded teammates under fire, often with limited supplies and no backup. Sarah found herself impressed by his knowledge and his humble approach to learning. "You know," Parker said, glancing toward where Colonel Brennan stood talking to several other senior officers, "don't take the colonel's attitude personally. He's old school, believes the military way is the only way. He doesn't adapt well to new ideas, especially from civilians." Sarah shrugged. "I've dealt with worse. Every hospital has at least one attending physician who thinks their way is the only correct way. You learn to work around them." Parker smiled at that, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of recognition or perhaps respect, that Sarah couldn't quite read. Before she could ask about it, Dr. Hernandez called everyone back to their seats for the second half of the meeting. The afternoon session focused more on specific protocols and potential training programs. Sarah presented a proposal for an exchange program where military medics could spend time in civilian trauma centers and civilian emergency physicians could participate in military field training exercises. The idea was met with enthusiasm from most of the room, though Colonel Brennan predictably found reasons to object. "We don't need civilians teaching our medics how to do their jobs," he declared. "Our training programs have been refined over decades. They're tested in real combat situations. What can a hospital doctor possibly teach a combat medic that they don't already know?" Lieutenant Parker, who had been quietly listening, cleared his throat. "With respect, sir, civilian trauma surgeons deal with a wider variety of injuries on a more consistent basis than most combat medics. A medic might go months without seeing serious trauma, but a busy urban emergency room sees it every single day. That kind of consistent experience has value." Colonel Brennan turned his stern gaze on Parker. "Lieutenant, when I want input from junior officers, I'll ask for it." Parker didn't flinch. "Yes, sir. My apologies for speaking out of turn." But Sarah noticed that several other officers nodded in agreement with Parker's point. The seeds of the idea were taking root, regardless of the colonel's objections. As the meeting drew toward its conclusion, Dr. Hernandez thanked Sarah for her time and her insights. "We'll be in touch soon about moving forward with some of these proposals," she said. "I think there's real potential here for meaningful collaboration." Sarah gathered her materials, feeling satisfied despite Colonel Brennan's attitude. She had made connections with several officers who seemed genuinely interested in improving medical training through civilian partnerships. That was what mattered. She was heading toward the door when Colonel Brennan's voice stopped her. "Dr. Chen, a word before you go." Sarah turned, keeping her expression neutral. "Yes, Colonel?" He approached her, his bearing military straight, his face stern. "I want to be clear about something. I have nothing against civilian doctors in general, but I believe strongly in military protocol and respect for the chain of command. The way you're dressed today shows a lack of respect for this institution and everyone in it. If you want to work with military personnel, you need to understand that appearances matter. Professionalism matters." Sarah felt anger flare in her chest, but she kept her voice level. "Colonel Brennan, I was told this was an informal consultation, essentially a conversation among colleagues. I dressed appropriately for what I was told to expect. I'm sorry if my attire offends you, but I assure you that my clothes don't affect my medical knowledge or my ability to save lives." "That attitude right there," Brennan said, shaking his head, "is exactly the problem. No sense of decorum, no understanding of tradition. The military isn't like your civilian world where everyone does whatever they want. We have standards." Before Sarah could respond, Lieutenant Parker's voice cut through the tension. "Colonel Brennan, sir, May I have a word? Brennan turned, irritation clear on his face. What is it, Lieutenant? Parker stepped forward, and something in his demeanor had changed. The easygoing friendliness from earlier was gone, replaced by something more formal and commanding. Sir, I believe you may be speaking without full information about Dr. Chen's background. I don't need her background, Brennan snapped. What I need is for civilian contractors to show proper respect when they come onto a military installation. Dr. Chen isn't a civilian contractor, sir, Parker said quietly. Brennan frowned. What are you talking about? Of course she is. She works at a civilian hospital. She does now, sir, Parker agreed. But Dr. Chen is also a Navy Reserve medical officer. She holds the rank of commander. The room went completely silent. Sarah felt her heart skip. She had mentioned her reserve status to Dr. Morrison months ago when they first discussed this meeting, but she hadn't thought it would come up today. She certainly hadn't expected it to become an issue. Colonel Brennan's face went through several shades of red. She's not in uniform. How was I supposed to know? You weren't, sir, Parker said. Because you didn't ask. You made assumptions based on appearances. The weight of Parker's words hung in the air. Other officers in the room had stopped their conversations and were watching the scene unfold. Sarah could see the realization dawning on several faces. Could see them remembering every dismissive comment Brennan had made during the meeting. Furthermore, sir, Parker continued, his voice still respectful but firm. Dr. Chen served 2 tours in Afghanistan as a field surgeon. She was attached to the 3rd Marines during the Helmand Province operation in 2019. She performed over 200 combat surgeries under fire and was awarded the Bronze Star with Valor for her actions during a Taliban ambush on her forward operating base. The silence in the room was deafening. Sarah watched Colonel Brennan's face as the full impact of what he had done crashed over him. He had spent the entire morning belittling and dismissing a decorated military officer, someone who had more combat medical experience than most of the people in the room. I didn't, Brennan started, then stopped. He looked at Sarah, and for the first time she saw uncertainty in his eyes. Why didn't you say something? Why didn't you correct me? Sarah met his gaze steadily. Because my rank and my service record shouldn't matter in a medical discussion, Colonel. My ideas and my experience should stand on their own merit, regardless of whether I'm wearing a uniform or jeans. The protocols I presented today are valuable because they work and they save lives, not because of who I am or what I've done. She paused, letting that sink in, then continued more softly. But since we're talking about it now, yes, I served. I know exactly what combat medicine looks like. I've performed surgeries in tents while mortars fell around us. I've triaged patients by flashlight when the generators failed. I've held the hands of dying soldiers and promised to write to their families. So when you suggest that I don't understand battlefield conditions, Colonel, you're wrong. I understand them better than I wish I did. The room remained quiet. Sarah could see respect in the eyes of the officers around her, but also something else. Shame, perhaps, for not having defended her earlier. Recognition of their own quick judgments. Dr. Hernandez broke the silence. I apologize, Dr. Chen. I should have made your background clear at the start of the meeting. I assumed everyone had reviewed the briefing materials I sent out last week, which included your full biography. Colonel Brennan cleared his throat. I may not have read those materials as thoroughly as I should have. He looked at Sarah, and to his credit, there was genuine remorse in his expression now. Dr. Chen, I owe you an apology. I was disrespectful and dismissive. I judged you based on appearance rather than substance. That was wrong of me. Sarah nodded slowly. I appreciate that, Colonel. But I have to ask, Brennan continued, why dress so casually if you knew you were coming to a military installation? Why not wear your uniform? Because Dr. Morrison specifically told me this would be an informal meeting, Sarah explained. She said to dress comfortably, that it would just be a few doctors talking over coffee. I didn't realize it had turned into a formal briefing until I arrived. And by then, it seemed more important to focus on the content of what I was presenting, rather than what I was wearing. Lieutenant Parker spoke up again. For what it's worth, sir, I think Dr. Chen's approach was more valuable than if she had shown up in uniform. She gave us a real look at how civilian emergency medicine operates, without the formality and protocol that might have influenced the discussion. We got honest insights instead of a sanitized military presentation. Several officers nodded in agreement. The mood in the room had shifted dramatically from where it had been an hour ago. Where there had been skepticism and dismissal, there was now respect and genuine interest. But Sarah was tired. The emotional toll of the morning, the constant need to prove herself, the revelation of her military service, it had all drained her more than a 12-hour shift in the trauma bay. She wanted to leave, to get back to her car and drive home and forget about Colonel Brennan's condescending remarks. "If there's nothing else," she said, gathering her bag, "I should probably go. Thank you all for your time today. Dr. Hernandez, we can discuss the next steps over email." "Of course," Dr. Hernandez said warmly. "Thank you for coming, Commander Chen. And again, my apologies for the confusion today." Sarah headed for the door, aware that every eye in the room was on her. She had almost made it out when Lieutenant Parker caught up with her in the hallway. "Commander Chen," he said, falling into step beside her. "I wanted to apologize as well. I should have said something earlier during the meeting, when Colonel Brennan was being disrespectful." Sarah looked at him, curious. "How did you know about my service record? I didn't mention it during the meeting." Parker smiled slightly. "I was in Afghanistan in 2019, different unit. But we were operating in the same region. Every combat soldier knew about the Navy surgeon who refused to leave her patients during the Taliban assault. The stories about you spread through the whole theater. When I saw your name on the briefing materials, I looked you up. I wanted to confirm it was the same Dr. Chen." Sarah felt a wave of emotion wash over her. Those days in Afghanistan felt like another lifetime, a chapter of her life she had carefully tucked away in a corner of her mind. The memories were still vivid when she let them surface. The heat, the dust, the constant sound of helicopters bringing in wounded soldiers, the face of every patient she had lost. "That was a long time ago," she said quietly as they walked toward the elevator. "I'm just a regular emergency room doctor now." "There's nothing regular about saving lives," Parker replied. "Whether it's in a combat zone or a city hospital. What you do matters, Commander." They reached the elevator and Sarah pressed the button. "Please, just call me Sarah. I'm not really active duty anymore. I do my reserve weekends and my annual training, but my real life is at the hospital." "Fair enough," Parker said. "And you can call me James when we're not around senior officers who care about that kind of thing." The elevator arrived and they stepped inside. As the doors closed, James turned to her with a more serious expression. "Can I ask you something? Why did you let Colonel Brennan treat you that way? You outrank him in the Navy. You could have shut him down immediately." Sarah considered the question as they descended. Because proving someone wrong by pulling rank doesn't actually change their mind. It just makes them resentful. "I've found that people respect competence more than they respect rank. If I had walked in there and immediately announced my military service, everyone would have treated me differently. But they wouldn't have actually listened to what I had to say. They would have been too busy trying to figure out how to respond to a superior officer." "That's a very mature way of looking at it," James observed. "It's a tired way of looking at it," Sarah corrected with a slight smile. "I've spent years being underestimated because I'm young and I'm a woman, and I don't look like what people expect a trauma surgeon to look like. You can either spend all your energy fighting those assumptions up front, or you can let your work speak for itself. Most of the time, I choose the latter." The elevator doors opened on the ground floor, and they walked together toward the exit. The morning fog had burned off, and bright sunshine filled the parking lot. Sarah pulled her car keys from her pocket, ready to end this strange and exhausting day. But James wasn't quite ready to let her go. "Listen, I know this morning was rough, but I hope you won't let Colonel Brennan's attitude discourage you from working with us. There are a lot of people here, myself included, who really want to build better bridges between military and civilian medicine. Your insights today were valuable, regardless of what the colonel said." Sarah paused by her car, studying the young SEAL lieutenant. There was sincerity in his eyes, and she found herself wanting to believe him. "Can I ask you something now? Why did you speak up? You're a junior officer. Contradicting a colonel can't be great for your career." James shrugged. Some things are more important than career advancement, like standing up for what's right, like defending someone who's being treated unfairly. My father taught me that. Your father sounds like a wise man. He was, James said, a shadow passing over his face. He was a Marine, killed in Iraq in 2005. I'm sorry, Sarah said softly, meaning it. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Two people who had both seen the costs of war, who both carried the weight of trying to save lives in impossible situations. Well, Sarah finally said, I should probably get going. I have a shift tonight. Of course, James said. But before you go, would it be okay if I got your contact information? Not for anything weird, he added quickly. But I'd really like to continue the conversation about the training exchange program. I think you're exactly the kind of person we need to make it work. Sarah smiled at his awkwardness. For all his military bearing and combat experience, he suddenly seemed very young. Sure. Do you have a card? James pulled out a business card from his wallet and handed it to her. Sarah glanced at it, noting his official contact information, then pulled out her phone and entered the details. I'll send you an email next week, she said. We can set up a time to talk more about the program details. That would be great, James said, visibly pleased. And Sarah? Thank you for your service, both your military service and what you do every day at the hospital. People like you make a difference. Sarah felt unexpected tears prick at her eyes. It had been a long time since someone had thanked her for her service, in a way that felt genuine rather than perfunctory. Thank you, James. That means a lot. She got in her car and started the engine, giving him a small wave as she pulled out of the parking space. In her rearview mirror, she could see him standing there, watching her go, his hands in his pockets and a thoughtful expression on his face. The drive back to Los Angeles took about 2 hours, giving Sarah plenty of time to process the morning's events. She had gone to that meeting expecting a simple consultation about medical protocols. Instead, she had ended up confronting old wounds, old identities, and old assumptions about how she wanted to present herself to the world. When she had left the Navy and returned to civilian medicine, she had made a conscious decision to separate those two parts of her life. Her colleagues at Los Angeles Memorial knew she was in the reserves, but she rarely talked about her deployment experiences. Those memories were too raw, too painful, and too personal to share with people who hadn't been there. But today had forced her to acknowledge that those experiences were still a part of who she was. They informed how she practiced medicine, how she handled stress, how she prioritized in crisis situations. She couldn't completely separate Commander Sarah Chen from Dr. Sarah Chen because they were the same person, forged in the same fires. By the time she pulled into the parking garage at her apartment building, Sarah had made a decision. She wasn't going to let Colonel Brennan's initial dismissiveness define her experience with the military medical community. There were too many good people there, like Dr. Hernandez and Lieutenant Parker, who genuinely wanted to improve care for both soldiers and civilians. If she could contribute to that mission, she had an obligation to try. She spent the afternoon catching up on sleep, knowing she would need to be sharp for her overnight shift in the emergency room. When her alarm went off at 6 in the evening, she got up, showered, and put on her scrubs, the familiar ritual helping her transition into work mode. The shift started quietly enough, with a few minor cases. A kid with a broken arm from skateboarding, an elderly woman with chest pain that turned out to be indigestion, a construction worker with a nail gun injury to his hand. But Sarah knew from experience that quiet nights in the ER never lasted long. Around midnight, the radio crackled to life. Incoming trauma, multi-vehicle accident on the 405, 5 critical patients, ETA 7 minutes. The emergency room exploded into controlled chaos. Nurses prepped trauma bays, respiratory therapists readied ventilators, and the blood bank was put on alert. Sarah pulled on a yellow trauma gown and snapped on gloves, her mind already running through protocols and priorities. The ambulances arrived in quick succession, bringing a cascade of broken bodies and life-threatening injuries. Sarah moved from patient to patient, making rapid assessments, barking orders, and making split-second decisions about who needed surgery immediately and who could wait. One patient, a young man barely out of his teens, had a penetrating chest wound from a piece of metal that had torn through the car door. He was conscious but struggling to breathe, his lips turning blue from lack of oxygen. Sarah could hear the sucking sound of a tension, pneumothorax, air escaping into the chest cavity and collapsing the lung. "I need a chest tube kit now," she called out, already moving to position the patient. There was no time to wait for surgery, no time for formal protocols. She had maybe 2 minutes before the kid's heart stopped from the pressure building in his chest. The nurse slapped the kit into her hand, and Sarah's training took over. Her hands moved with practiced precision, finding the space between the ribs, making the incision, inserting the tube. The rush of air and blood that followed was simultaneously horrifying and reassuring. Horrifying because it showed how serious the injury was. Reassuring because it meant she had relieved the pressure in time. The young man gasped, his color immediately improving as his lung re-expanded. "You're okay," Sarah told him, her voice calm and steady, even as her heart raced. "You're going to be okay. We're going to take good care of you." The rest of the night blurred together in a series of similar moments. Decisions made in seconds, lives hanging in the balance, the constant calculation of risk and benefit and probability. By the time the sun rose, Sarah had sent 3 patients to surgery, stabilized 2 others for intensive care, and pronounced 1 dead despite their best efforts. She stood in the locker room at the end of her shift, peeling off her blood-stained scrubs and feeling the familiar weight of exhaustion settle over her. This was her real life, this constant battle against death and injury. The meeting at the military base felt like it had happened weeks ago rather than just yesterday. But when she checked her phone, she found an email waiting from Dr. Hernandez. The subject line read, "Next Steps for Collaboration Program." Sarah sat down on the bench, still in her sports bra and scrub pants, and read the email. Dr. Hernandez apologized again for the confusion and Colonel Brennan's behavior, then outlined a proposal for a pilot program. They wanted to send 4 military combat medics to spend a month at Los Angeles Memorial, shadowing trauma surgeons and emergency room physicians. In exchange, they would host 4 civilian emergency medicine physicians for a 2-week field training exercise. The email ended with a direct request. "Commander Chen, we would like you to serve as the lead coordinator for the civilian side of this program. Your unique experience with both military and civilian medicine makes you the ideal person to bridge these 2 worlds. Would you be interested?" Sarah sat there for a long moment, her tired mind weighing the decision. Taking on this role would mean more work, more meetings, more time away from her regular duties. It would mean reopening doors to her military past that she had carefully kept closed. It would mean putting herself in situations where she might face more Colonel Brennans, more people who judged her before giving her a chance. But it would also mean making a real difference in how combat medics were trained. It would mean potentially saving the lives of soldiers on future battlefields by giving their medics better tools and knowledge. It would mean honoring the memory of the soldiers she had treated in Afghanistan, the ones she had saved and the ones she had lost. She thought about the young man from last night, the one with the chest wound who had looked at her with terrified eyes as she inserted the chest tube. She thought about the soldiers she had treated in similar situations overseas, working by flashlight in a forward operating base while mortars exploded in the distance. The environments were different, but the fundamental mission was the same: save lives, no matter what. Sarah pulled up her email and began typing a response. "Dr. Hernandez, thank you for the opportunity. I would be honored to serve as the lead coordinator for this program. When can we meet to discuss the details?" She hit send before she could second-guess herself, then finished changing and headed out to her car. The morning Los Angeles traffic was already building, cars packed bumper to bumper on the streets. Sarah navigated through it on autopilot, her mind already spinning with ideas for the training program. By the time she got home, she had mentally outlined a curriculum that would give military medics exposure to the full range of civilian trauma medicine. They would rotate through the emergency room, the operating rooms, the intensive care unit, and even ride along with paramedics on ambulance calls. They would see gunshot wounds and stabbings, car accidents and industrial injuries, drug overdoses and cardiac arrests. They would learn to manage resources, communicate with families, and handle the emotional toll of continuous trauma care. And the civilian physicians who went through the military training would learn things that couldn't be taught in a hospital: They would learn to work with limited supplies, to improvise when equipment failed, to stay calm under literal fire. They would learn the unique challenges of treating combat injuries, the difference between civilian trauma and battlefield wounds. Sarah collapsed into bed, but sleep didn't come immediately. Her mind was too active, too engaged with the possibilities. For the first time in years, she felt excited about something beyond her daily work in the emergency room. This program could be something special, something that would have lasting impact. Her phone buzzed with an incoming text. She picked it up and saw a message from an unknown number. "Hi, Dr. Chen. This is James Parker. Dr. Hernandez told me you agreed to lead the collaboration program. That's fantastic news. I've been assigned as the military liaison for the project. Looking forward to working with you." Sarah smiled and typed back a quick response. "Looking forward to it too. Let's set up a planning meeting next week." She set the phone aside and finally let herself drift off to sleep. But her dreams were filled with images from both worlds. The sterile white lights of the hospital emergency room blending with the harsh sun of the Afghan desert, the beeping of monitors mixing with the sound of helicopter rotors, the faces of patients both civilian and military all looking to her for help, for hope, for healing. When she woke up that afternoon, Sarah felt energized despite the minimal sleep. She spent the evening researching existing trauma training programs, both military and civilian, looking for best practices and potential gaps they could address. She made lists of equipment, created draft schedules, and outlined learning objectives. Her phone rang around 7 that evening. The caller ID showed Dr. Morrison, the head of emergency services who had originally invited her to the military base. "Sarah, I am so sorry about yesterday," Dr. Morrison said as soon as Sarah answered. "I got your message about what happened with Colonel Brennan. I can't believe he treated you that way." "It's okay, Patricia," Sarah assured her. "It actually worked out in the end. Dr. Hernandez offered me the coordinator position for the collaboration program." "I heard," Patricia said, "and I think it's brilliant. But I need to tell you something. Colonel Brennan called me this afternoon. He wants to apologize to you directly." Sarah felt a flicker of surprise. "He already apologized at the meeting." "I know, but apparently that wasn't enough for him. He's really torn up about what happened. He asked if you would meet with him again, just the two of you, so he could apologize properly. No pressure if you don't want to, but I told him I would pass along the message." Sarah considered it. Part of her wanted to just move forward and forget about the whole incident, but another part of her recognized that this could be an opportunity. If Colonel Brennan was genuinely willing to acknowledge his mistakes and learn from them, that could make the whole collaboration program run more smoothly. "Okay," she said finally. "Tell him I'll meet with him. But it has to be on my turf this time. He can come to Los Angeles Memorial if he wants to talk." "I'll let him know," Patricia said. "And Sarah? Thank you for being willing to give him another chance. Not everyone would." After hanging up, Sarah sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea and thought about Grace. About second chances and the possibility of change. She had seen people at their worst in the emergency room, stripped of pretense and dignity by pain and fear. And she had seen those same people, once healed, become better versions of themselves. Maybe Colonel Brennan deserved the same opportunity. Maybe his initial judgment said more about his own insecurities and rigid worldview than they did about Sarah. Maybe, just maybe, this whole situation could become something positive. 2 days later, Colonel Richard Brennan walked into Los Angeles Memorial Hospital wearing civilian clothes and carrying a coffee from the shop across the street. Sarah met him in a small conference room off the main emergency department. Through the glass walls, they could see the organized chaos of the ER, nurses and doctors moving efficiently between patient rooms. Brennan stood when Sarah entered the room, his posture stiff and formal despite the casual clothes. He looked uncomfortable, like a fish out of water in the civilian medical environment. Sarah gestured for him to sit and took the chair across from him. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me," Brennan began. His voice was different from the confident, authoritative tone he had used at the military base. Now he sounded uncertain, almost humble. "I know you didn't have to." "I was curious," Sarah said honestly. "Dr. Morrison said you wanted to apologize, but you already did that at the meeting." Brennan nodded. his weathered hands clasped on the table in front of him. I did, but that apology was forced out of me by circumstances. I was embarrassed in front of my colleagues, and I said what needed to be said to save face. This time, I wanted to apologize properly without an audience because you deserve better than what I gave you that day. Sarah studied him, trying to gauge his sincerity. She had developed a good sense for when people were being genuine over her years, dealing with patients who lied about their symptoms or family members who made promises they wouldn't keep. Brennan seemed genuinely uncomfortable, but in a way that suggested real remorse rather than resentment. Go on, she said. Brennan took a breath. I spent 32 years in the Army. I came up through the ranks the hard way, starting as an enlisted man and working my way to colonel. In that world, everything has its place. There are rules and protocols for everything, and those rules exist for good reasons. They keep people alive. They maintain order in chaos. He paused, looking out at the emergency room through the glass. A team of nurses was rushing a gurney past, a patient on it receiving chest compressions. But somewhere along the way, Brennan continued, I stopped seeing those rules as tools and started seeing them as ends in themselves. I forgot that the point of military discipline isn't to make everyone conform for its own sake. It's to create effective units that can accomplish their missions. And the most important mission in military medicine is saving lives. Sarah remained quiet, letting him work through whatever he needed to say. When you walked into that conference room in jeans and a sweater, I saw a violation of protocol, Brennan admitted. I saw someone who didn't respect the institution I've dedicated my life to. I didn't see a doctor, or a fellow officer, or a decorated combat veteran. I just saw someone who wasn't following the rules, and I responded accordingly. You made assumptions, Sarah said. I made terrible assumptions, Brennan corrected, based entirely on superficial observations. And then, when you started presenting your ideas, instead of actually listening to the content, I spent the whole time looking for ways to dismiss you. I was more invested in being right about my initial judgment than in being open to what you had to teach us. He met her eyes directly. That's not just unprofessional. It's dangerous. In medicine, that kind of closed-minded thinking gets people killed. If I was treating a patient and I made diagnoses based on appearances rather than symptoms, I'd be guilty of malpractice. What I did to you was the intellectual equivalent of that. Sarah felt some of her anger from the other day dissipate. This wasn't a man making excuses or shifting blame. This was someone who had genuinely reflected on his behavior and understood its implications. I appreciate you telling me this, she said. And for what it's worth, I accept your apology. Brennan looked relieved but also curious. Can I ask you something? Why didn't you put me in my place immediately? You had every right to, and you certainly had the rank to do it. Sarah smiled slightly. Because proving someone wrong doesn't change their mind. It just makes them defensive. I've learned that people respect competence more than they respect authority. If I had walked in and announced my rank and my service record, you might have been more polite, but you wouldn't have actually listened to my ideas. You would have been too busy performing respect for a superior officer. That's remarkably mature, Brennan observed. And probably more effective in the long run. Maybe, Sarah said. Or maybe I'm just tired of constantly having to prove myself. Sometimes it's easier to let people underestimate me and then let the work speak for itself. They sat in companionable silence for a moment. Out in the emergency room, Sarah could see her colleagues dealing with a steady stream of patients. An elderly man clutching his chest, a young woman with a badly twisted ankle, a child with what looked like a minor head wound. This is your battlefield, isn't it? Brennan said, following her gaze. Every day, Sarah confirmed. The wounds are different, the circumstances are different, but the mission is the same. Save as many as we can. Live with the ones we can't. Brennan nodded slowly. Lieutenant Parker told me what you did in Afghanistan. About the Taliban assault on your FOB. He said you stayed in the medical tent treating wounded while the base was under direct fire. You refused to evacuate even when ordered. Sarah felt the old memories stir. There were soldiers on my operating table. I couldn't leave them. You operated for 14 hours straight while mortars were falling around you, Brennan continued. You saved 17 men that day. 3 of them wouldn't have survived a medical evacuation. They owed their lives to your decision to stay. I did what any surgeon would do, Sarah said quietly. I took care of my patients. No, Brennan said firmly. Any surgeon would have followed the evacuation order. What you did was extraordinary, and I should have known that before I opened my mouth at that meeting. The information was right there in the briefing materials. I just didn't bother to read them thoroughly. He shook his head, self-disgust evident on his face. I've spent years lecturing junior officers about the importance of intelligence, of knowing your terrain and knowing your enemy. And I walked into that meeting completely ignorant about who I was dealing with. I failed my own standards, and I failed you. You're being pretty hard on yourself, Sarah observed. I should be, Brennan replied. If I don't hold myself accountable for my mistakes, how can I expect the people under my command to do better? Sarah appreciated his honesty. It took real strength to admit errors this completely, especially for someone who had built a career on being right and being in control. Can I show you something? She asked. Brennan looked surprised but nodded. Of course. Sarah led him out of the conference room and into the emergency department proper. She stopped at the main desk where the charge nurse, a formidable woman named Rita, was coordinating patient flow. Rita, this is Colonel Brennan. He's helping us set up that military collaboration program. Mind if I give him a quick tour? Rita sized up Brennan with experienced eyes, then shrugged. As long as you don't get in the way, we've got a full house tonight. Sarah walked Brennan through the department, explaining their triage system, their protocols for mass casualties, their communication networks. She showed him their supply closets, deliberately sparse to mirror the resource constraints medics might face in the field. She introduced him to the rapid response team, the nurses who handled the most critical patients, the technicians who kept their equipment running. As they walked, Brennan asked increasingly engaged questions. He wanted to know about response times, about decision-making hierarchies, about how they trained new staff. His military background gave him a framework for understanding the structure, but Sarah could see him recognizing the differences too, the ways civilian medicine had developed its own effective systems. They ended up in the trauma bay, where Sarah's colleague, Dr. Marcus Chen, was suturing a laceration on a construction worker's arm. Marcus looked up and gave Sarah a questioning look. Just showing a colleague around, Sarah explained. Marcus, this is Colonel Brennan. He's involved in the military training program we're developing. Marcus nodded a greeting, then returned his attention to his patient. You're lucky, he told the construction worker. Another inch and you would have hit the artery. Would have bled out before the ambulance arrived. The worker paled. I just slipped with the saw, wasn't paying attention. Well, pay attention next time, Marcus said, but his tone was kind rather than scolding. I'm going to give you instructions for wound care. Follow them exactly, and take the full course of antibiotics I'm prescribing, even if it feels better. Deal? Deal, Doc. Thank you. Sarah led Brennan out of the trauma bay and back toward the conference room. That's what we deal with every day. Construction accidents, car crashes, industrial injuries, assaults, drug overdoses, a constant stream of people who made mistakes or got unlucky or were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And our job is to give them a second chance. It's humbling, Brennan said, watching you all work. The military has this idea that we're the real heroes, that combat medicine is somehow more important or more difficult than what you do here. But after spending an hour watching your team, I'm not sure that's true. You face the same life and death decisions, the same resource constraints, the same need for quick thinking and steady hands. Different environments, same mission, Sarah said. That's what I was trying to explain at the meeting. We can learn from each other because the fundamental challenges are similar. How do you prioritize when you have more patients than resources? How do you stay calm under pressure? How do you make life or death decisions in seconds? Those questions matter whether you're in a forward operating base or a city emergency room. Brennan settled back into his chair in the conference room. I understand now why Dr. Hernandez chose you to lead this program. You don't just have the medical expertise, you have the perspective to see beyond surface differences and find the underlying connections. I've had good teachers, Sarah said, both in the military and in civilian medicine. I'm just trying to pass along what I've learned. They talked for another hour about the specifics of the collaboration program. Brennan shared insights about military training methods, the challenges of teaching medicine in field conditions, the psychological pressures that combat medics faced. Sarah described the curriculum she was developing, the rotations she wanted the military medics to experience, the skills she hoped they would acquire. By the end of the conversation, they had sketched out a comprehensive plan that would benefit both military and civilian participants. Brennan proved to have a sharp mind for logistics and organization once he dropped the defensive arrogance he had displayed at their first meeting. "You know," he said as they wrapped up, "my daughter is applying to medical school this year. She wants to be a surgeon. After today, I'm going to tell her about you. About how real strength isn't about posturing or rank or following every rule perfectly. It's about competence, dedication, and the courage to focus on what matters even when people are judging you unfairly." Sarah felt touched. "I'd be happy to talk with her if she has questions about medical training or military service." "I'll take you up on that," Brennan said. He stood and extended his hand. "Thank you, Commander Chen, for your service, for your expertise, and for giving me a chance to be better than I was." Sarah shook his hand. "We all have bad days, Colonel. What matters is what we do next." After Brennan left, Sarah returned to the emergency room floor. Her shift was starting soon, and she wanted to check in with the team before things got busy. But Rita caught her arm as she passed the nurses' station. "That military guy seemed all right," Rita observed. "Very polite, asked good questions. Is he the one Patricia warned us about? The one who gave you trouble at that meeting?" "Same guy," Sarah confirmed. "But he came to apologize and actually meant it. People can surprise you sometimes." Rita snorted. "In this job, people surprise me every day, usually in bad ways. It's nice when they surprise you in good ways for a change." The shift that night was brutal. A gang shooting brought in 4 patients simultaneously, all with gunshot wounds to the chest and abdomen. Sarah operated on 2 of them, working alongside Marcus and another surgeon named Dr. Jennifer Lawson. They saved 3 out of the 4, losing a 17-year-old boy who had been shot in the heart. There was nothing they could have done differently. Sometimes the damage was just too severe. Sarah sat in the locker room afterward, still in her bloody scrubs, feeling the familiar weight of loss. She had learned to compartmentalize, to separate her emotions from her work. But that didn't mean the deaths didn't affect her. Each one was a reminder of the limits of medicine, the reality that even her best efforts couldn't save everyone. Her phone buzzed with a text from James Parker. "Hey, wanted to let you know that Colonel Brennan told everyone at this morning's briefing about his meeting with you. He actually used the phrase, 'I was wrong, and Dr. Chen was gracious enough to educate me.' Pretty sure that's the first time anyone has heard him admit he was wrong about anything. You must have made quite an impression." Sarah smiled despite her exhaustion and sadness. She typed back, "We just talked. Sometimes that's all it takes." Over the following weeks, Sarah threw herself into developing the collaboration program. She met with James regularly, usually over coffee at a cafe halfway between Los Angeles and San Diego. They became friends during those planning sessions, bonding over shared experiences and a mutual commitment to improving trauma care. James told her about his SEAL team experiences, about missions in Afghanistan and Iraq and other places he couldn't name. He described the unique challenges of combat medicine, where the medic was also a warrior, where treating the wounded meant making yourself vulnerable in active combat zones. Sarah shared her own war stories, both from Afghanistan and from the civilian emergency room. She helped James understand the psychological toll that constant trauma exposure took on medical staff, and they developed plans for mental health support as part of the training program. They selected the first cohort of participants together, 4 combat medics who showed exceptional promise and were hungry to expand their skills, and 4 civilian emergency physicians who were interested in military medicine and had the flexibility to take 2 weeks away from their practices. Colonel Brennan, to his credit, became one of the program's strongest advocates. He used his influence within the military medical community to secure funding, arrange facilities, and navigate bureaucratic obstacles. He also reached out to Sarah several times for advice, asking questions with genuine curiosity rather than the defensiveness he had shown initially. The program launched 6 months after that first disastrous meeting. The military medics arrived at Los Angeles Memorial on a Monday morning, looking sharp in their uniforms and slightly overwhelmed by the chaos of the urban emergency room. Sarah gathered them in the same conference room where she had met with Colonel Brennan. Welcome to Los Angeles Memorial. Over the next month, you're going to see things that will challenge you, exhaust you, and maybe even disturb you. You're going to treat patients who made terrible decisions. You're going to see injuries that resulted from violence, addiction, and poverty. It's different from combat medicine in many ways, but the same in the most important way. Our job is to save lives without judgment. One of the medics, a young woman named Sergeant Emily Rodriguez, raised her hand. Ma'am, I've read about your service in Afghanistan. Is it true you performed over 200 surgeries in combat zones? Sarah nodded. Yes, but I don't tell you that to intimidate you. I tell you so you understand that I know where you're coming from. I know what it's like to work under fire, with limited supplies, and with wounded teammates depending on you. This environment is different, but the principles we'll teach you here will make you better combat medics. Trust me on that. The month that followed was intense. The military medics rotated through different areas of the hospital, learning to handle the full spectrum of civilian trauma. They observed surgeries, worked in the intensive care unit, and rode along on ambulance calls. They saw gunshot wounds and stabbings, car accidents and falls, heart attacks and strokes. Sarah made sure to spend time with each of them, debriefing after difficult cases, answering questions, and helping them process what they were experiencing. She was particularly impressed by Sergeant Rodriguez, who proved to have exceptional diagnostic instincts and a calm demeanor under pressure. Meanwhile, the 4 civilian physicians traveled to Camp Pendleton for their military field training. They learned to work with limited supplies, to improvise medical equipment, and to provide care in austere environments. They trained on tactical combat casualty care, practiced treating simulated combat wounds, and experienced what it was like to work as part of a military unit. The program was demanding for everyone involved, but the results were remarkable. The military medics returned to their units with new skills and broader perspectives. The civilian physicians came back with deeper appreciation for the challenges their military colleagues faced and new techniques they could apply in their own practices. At the graduation ceremony, held at the Military Medical Center where this whole journey had begun, Colonel Brennan gave a speech that surprised everyone. 6 months ago, he said, standing at a podium in front of all the program participants, their families, and military and civilian medical leadership, I made a serious mistake. I judged someone based on their appearance rather than their competence. I dismissed expertise because it was packaged differently than I expected. And in doing so, I almost prevented this program from happening. He paused, looking directly at Sarah, who was seated in the front row. Commander Dr. Boyce. Sarah Chen walked into a meeting at this facility wearing jeans and a sweater. I saw that as disrespect. What I should have seen was a dedicated physician who was told to dress casually for an informal meeting. I saw a civilian who didn't understand military culture. What I should have seen was a decorated combat veteran who understood military medicine better than most people in that room. The audience was silent, hanging on his words. But here's what I've learned from this experience. Real professionalism isn't about wearing the right uniform or following every protocol perfectly. Real professionalism is about competence, dedication, and the courage to do the right thing even when it's difficult. Commander Chen demonstrated that kind of professionalism when she chose to focus on sharing her knowledge rather than putting me in my place for my rudeness. She demonstrated it when she agreed to lead this program despite my initial hostility. And she's demonstrated it every day since by her commitment to making this collaboration successful. He looked out at the military medics who had completed the program. You 4 have had the privilege of training under one of the finest trauma surgeons in this country. Don't just remember the medical techniques she taught you. Remember the professionalism she modeled. Remember that competence speaks louder than rank. Remember that real strength doesn't need to announce itself or demand respect. It simply does the work and lets the results speak. After the ceremony, people crowded around Sarah to congratulate her and thank her for the program. But the moment that meant the most came when Colonel Brennan approached with a young woman in her early 20s. Commander Chen, he said, I'd like you to meet my daughter, Elizabeth. She starts medical school in the fall. Elizabeth shook Sarah's hand enthusiastically. My dad has told me so much about your work in Afghanistan and what you do at the hospital. You're kind of my hero. Sarah felt embarrassed by the praise. I'm just a doctor doing my job. No, Elizabeth said firmly. You're showing people like me that we can be excellent at what we do without having to be loud about it or put others down to prove ourselves. That's incredibly valuable. Later, as the crowds thinned and people began to leave, James Parker found Sarah standing alone near the windows, looking out at the base. Penny for your thoughts? He asked. Sarah turned to him with a smile, just reflecting on how strange life is. 6 months ago, I came here expecting a simple consultation meeting. Instead, I ended up creating something that might actually make a real difference for a lot of people. It already has made a difference, James said. Those 4 medics are going to take what they learned here back to their units. They'll teach others, and those others will teach more people. The knowledge spreads like ripples in a pond, and the civilian doctors who trained with us are already implementing new protocols in their hospitals. I know, Sarah said. It's humbling. Can I tell you something? James asked. The day you came for that first meeting, I recognized your name immediately. I had heard the stories about you in Afghanistan, about the surgeon who stayed in the medical tent during that Taliban assault. We all knew about you. You were a legend. Sarah looked at him in surprise. I never wanted to be a legend. I just wanted to do my job and keep people alive. I know, James said gently. That's what makes you one. Real heroes don't set out to be heroic. They just do what needs to be done, even when it's hard, even when it's dangerous, even when they don't get recognition for it. He paused, then continued. When Colonel Brennan was being dismissive during that meeting, I was furious. But I also understood something about you from watching how you handled it. You didn't need validation from him or anyone else because you know who you are and what you're worth. That kind of quiet confidence is rare. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. Thank you, James. That means a lot. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sun begin to set over the military base. The golden light painted everything in warm tones, softening the hard edges of the buildings and making the whole scene look almost peaceful. What's next for you? James asked. Are you going to keep working with the program? Absolutely, Sarah said. We're already planning the next cohort, and I've been approached by 2 other military bases that want to set up similar programs. This is just the beginning. Good, James said with satisfaction. Because we need more people like you building bridges between different worlds. Too many people are content to stay in their own bubbles, never learning from others. What you're doing matters. In the months that followed, the collaboration program expanded beyond anyone's initial expectations. More military bases signed on, more civilian hospitals expressed interest. Sarah found herself traveling frequently, setting up new programs, training trainers, and constantly refining the curriculum based on feedback from participants. Her work at Los Angeles Memorial continued as well, the daily rhythm of emergency medicine that anchored her life. But now she approached it with renewed purpose, knowing that the skills she practiced every day in the ER were contributing to a larger mission of improving trauma care for both civilians and military personnel. Colonel Brennan became an unlikely ally and friend. He would occasionally call her for advice, and once even invited her to speak at a military medical conference about the importance of humility and open-mindedness in medicine. He had become, in his own way, an advocate for the very principles he had initially resisted. One evening, about a year after that first meeting, Sarah was working a late shift in the emergency room when a familiar face appeared at the nurse's station. It was Sergeant Rodriguez, the young medic who had excelled during the training program. Sergeant Rodriguez, Sarah exclaimed. What brings you here? Rodriguez smiled. I'm here to tell you something, ma'am. Our unit was deployed to Iraq 3 months ago. Last week, we were involved in a firefight, and I had to treat 3 wounded Marines under fire. I used the techniques I learned here at your hospital. The chest tube procedure you taught me, the triage protocols, the way to stay calm and focus on one patient at a time. All 3 Marines survived their injuries. She paused, her eyes bright with emotion. Those 3 men are alive because you took the time to teach me, because you believed this program was worth doing even when people like Colonel Brennan were initially resistant. I wanted you to know that your work matters, It saves lives in ways you might never see directly, but it absolutely matters. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the weight of those words. This was why she had pushed forward despite the initial resistance. This was why she had been willing to forgive Colonel Brennan's initial dismissiveness. Because somewhere, on a battlefield she would never see, Marines were alive because of knowledge shared in a Los Angeles emergency room. "Thank you for telling me," Sarah said softly. "That means everything." After Rodriguez left, Sarah stood for a moment in the middle of the busy emergency room, surrounded by the controlled chaos of trauma care, and felt a deep sense of peace. Her journey from that disastrous first meeting to this moment had been unexpected and sometimes difficult. She had faced judgment, dismissal, and doubt. But she had also found unexpected allies, created meaningful change, and touched lives in ways she never anticipated. All because she had chosen to respond to disrespect with patience, to answer judgment with competence, and to transform a negative experience into an opportunity for growth and connection. The automatic doors of the emergency room slid open, and paramedics rushed in with a new patient. Sarah pulled on fresh gloves and moved toward the trauma bay, her mind already shifting into diagnostic mode. There was work to be done, lives to save, and lessons to teach. And somewhere, a young woman would start medical school in the fall inspired by Sarah's example. Somewhere, combat medics would treat wounded soldiers using techniques learned in a civilian hospital. Somewhere, the ripples of one person's choice to respond to hostility with grace would continue spreading outward, changing the world in small but meaningful ways. That was the real legacy, Sarah realized. Not awards or recognition, but the quiet impact of doing the right thing consistently, of treating everyone with respect regardless of how they treated you, of believing that people could change and grow if given the chance. The colonel had scoffed at her attire. But in the end, what she wore had never mattered at all. What mattered was who she was, what she knew, and her willingness to share that knowledge with anyone ready to learn. Everything else was just noise,